During 5 or 6 board meetings, none of our ideas were passed. Jack had lost control of his pioneering venture, and at that time, I called myself a blind man riding on the back of blind tires. Hey guys, welcome back to Founders Talk. I'm Rachel, your startup lawyer, and in this episode, we're doing something special. We will be reviewing a book about Jack Ma, the house that Jack Ma built. In this video, I'll be going through some chapters that relates to legal matters that Jack Ma had to go through as he started his journey as an entrepreneur, and we'll be going through some of the common topics that startup founders like yourself will have to face. So the first chapter we'll be exploring is the chapter China is Coming On. In this chapter, we know that Alibaba is not Jack Ma's first venture. In fact, there was a venture called China Pages that Jack was a part of. Now let's read a little bit more about this venture on page 82 of the book. Years later, after Alibaba had become successful, Jack was free to comment on his experience in China Pages. China Pages was dwarfed by its new partner, and while Jack was the general manager, the position turned out to be of little value. When the joint venture was formed, he says, disaster followed. They had 5 votes on the board and we had 2. Whenever there was board meetings, whatever ideas I put forward, if one of them voted against it, the rest of them followed suit. During 5 or 6 board meetings, none of our ideas were passed. Jack had lost control of his pioneering venture, and at that time, I called myself a blind man riding on the back of blind tires. Now, I thought this point was interesting because a lot of entrepreneurs actually like to have some semblance of control over their company or their startup. So in this instance, when Jack Ma, who is very driven as an entrepreneur, cannot control the board composition of his company or the company that he's building, he doesn't feel very inspired to continue working on this venture. So for startup and VC funds who are drafting the shareholders agreement, that is probably something you might want to think about if you want your portfolio company to prosper. Now we move to the part of the story where we are more familiar with, which is Jack Ma's encounter as he built Alibaba. Now, Alibaba was not built overnight, and there were lots of difficulties that they faced. Like many startups, meeting the right people is important to the success of the startup. Now, at page 97, in May 1999, Jack met Joe Tsai. Now, who is Joe Tsai? A Taiwanese-born investor then living in Hong Kong that would become Jack's right-hand man. Now, if you Google Joe Tsai, he's actually this really good-looking guy who married a really good-looking lady and looks like he has the perfect family. But other than that, Joe Tsai was very pivotal in Jack Ma's journey in building Alibaba because Joe had the right connections, he had a good education, he had a good investment background, and he was pivotal in helping Jack Ma raise his first capital, big capital. So now, Joe Tsai is not only handsome, Joe is also a lawyer. And what is the first few things that Joe does for Alibaba when he joins? Part-time, actually. Joe's first task, in page 101, it states, was to document Alibaba's shareholders. I called him up and said, Jack, I'm incorporating the company. Who are the shareholders? He faxed me a list of the names. My jaw dropped because every single one of those kids in the apartment was on the list as a shareholder. So from day one, he gave a lot, quite a bit of equity. But as Joe looked through the 18 names, he realized that everybody was a crucial part of the team, whether an engineer or in customer service. Next, he wanted to get an understanding of Alibaba's customers. He asked the team how many there were. When they told him 28,000, Joe replied, wow, that's a big number. Yet all of the customer information was being stored manually, each one on a piece of paper stuffed into a book with all the others. Now, for modern day startups in Singapore, there are two things you want to think about. The first thing is, if you have so many shareholders from day one, you might become a public company much faster than you want to. So you might want to make sure that all your employees' shares are perhaps wrapped up in an ESOP vehicle if the intention is to give out shares to as many employees as Jack does. The second thing is, well, in the past, the problem was having too much information being stored in hard copy. These days, we have a lot of information stored online. But something that is really trending today, which was not trending in the past, is the prevalence of personal data protection. So it's very important to make sure you've got a privacy policy in place. Your personal data of your clients, especially if they're individuals, are stored in a way that's secure and that you do not breach PDPA or get a fine from PDPC even before your business starts. Now let's look at page 111 with the chapter that starts with Goldman Invests. Meanwhile, in Hong Kong, shortly after their unsuccessful fundraising trip to Silicon Valley, Joe had started negotiations with Transpac, a Singapore-based fund, about investing in Alibaba. Soon, they had agreed to a term sheet that would value Alibaba at $7 million. But Transpac insisted on an onerous provision, and Joe wanted to walk away. Now, let's figure out what the onerous provision is, and that's a footnote on the book. According to the footnote, it says, involving a participated preferred feature. So my guess is that they had some disagreement on the terms of the preference shares that would be awarded to Transpac as a result of this investment. So what does Joe do? He then calls up his friend at Goldman. Like Joe, Shirley Lin was born in Taiwan and educated in the US, and they had met a decade earlier on the plane, apparently, similar to how my parents also met each other. We're going to jump a little bit to page 112. Goldman had given Shirley and her team a lot of leeway, provided she kept the investments below $5 million. This was peanuts to Goldman, whose principal investment area unit would make $1 billion in investments in tech companies from 1995 to 2000. So what does Shirley do? Shirley visits the team in China. We call this physical due diligence, or meeting the management as part of the due diligence. And then the negotiations begin. On page 114, they discuss the investment over tea. If Goldman invested, she told Jack and Joe, the handsome Joe, she would personally ensure Alibaba was known to the world. With B2B competitors like Meet China waiting in the wings and actively fundraising, the offer proved too tempting to resist. Shirley negotiated to acquire a majority stake in Alibaba for $5 million. She headed back to Hong Kong, where her colleagues drew up the term sheet for the investment. Following weekend, Shirley was swimming with her family at the beach on the south side of Hong Kong when her cell phone rang. It was Jack. He really wanted to do the deal and asked Shirley to leave him more equity. Now you have to bear in mind at this point, Jack is probably in what we call like a pre-seed, seed round, or Series A round. So giving up a majority of your company for $5 million sounded a little bit expensive, and I'm glad he negotiated that. If Goldman took a controlling stake in his company, he explained, he didn't feel like a true entrepreneur. This is my life, he said. Shirley replied, what do you mean by this is your life? You have only started. Jack explained, but this is my third venture already. Jack finally convinced her, as convincing as he always is. The term sheet for the investment had been drawn up. There were brackets around the numbers, so it was easy to change. And Goldman would invest $5 million for 500,000 shares, half the company, while retaining veto rights over key decisions. Now let's break a couple of points up. The first thing is he says, if Goldman took a controlling stake in his company at such an early stage, he would not feel like a true entrepreneur. And that is a pattern that we see even from the China Pages days. And that is consistent with a lot of the entrepreneurs that I meet who would like to still have an operating and controlling stake in the companies. The second thing is Goldman then says, okay, I will not take a controlling stake in your company, but 50%. 50% means that decisions will not be able to be made unless perhaps both parties agree, or Goldman gets either Jack Ma and his co-founders to agree to a particular decision to cross past the 50% mark. And then they also retain veto rights over key decisions. Now, how would that be reflected in the deal terms? It would either be in the form of A, shareholder veto rights if they were already shareholders by then. B, if they appointed members to the board, then board reserve matter rights. Or C, if they were neither shareholders nor appointed board members at that time. Remember, Goldman is writing checks, 5 million or less, to lots of different companies and probably cannot afford to be appointing board members in every startup at that point in time. Then it could have perhaps been a contractor, right? That's embedded in a site letter or in an investment documentation which says that, hey, if Alibaba is going to make certain decisions, then Goldman's approval will be required. And then there is a twist to the plot at page 115. When Shirley took the deal to her investment committee, now Shirley has to get IC's approval, just like most funds, which oversaw all the funds investment. She encountered an unexpected snag. They pushed back. They did not want to invest in Alibaba. If Goldman invested the full 5 million, the fund would need to gain the approval of their investors. Please get rid of some, they told her. So Shirley reduced Goldman's stake to 33%, and now she had to find investors for the other 17%. Now, what can startup founders take back from this? When VC funds invest in startups, we kind of have to meet each other halfway. These funds have LPs or GPs or ICs to report to, and each fund also has their internal checkbook, and there's certain criteria that has been met. Now, in this instance, it seems to appear that if Goldman invests a full ticket of $5 million, more investor approval has to be obtained, and it's going to become more difficult. Let's go to the next paragraph. Today, the thought of having to cast urgently around for buyers willing to pay $1.7 million for a 17% stake in Alibaba, now worth tens of billions of dollars, is laughable. In the end, she brought in, ta-da, Thomas Ng of Venture TDF, who met Jack and Joe that summer for $500,000, and other guys as well. So that is the fun of fundraising. There is never a day that is dull. Even when you think you've secured something, the IC could disapprove and you guys have to switch deal terms or find co-investors to enter this deal as well.